Okay, so I'm now talking about problem text, but in this case, to carry on from the magic roundabout, to talk about narrators. Because one of the things that we must do when we deal with any text is ask questions about the narrator. And we can ask some basic things that is like you sort of just get used to handling, just get used to asking this. For instance, you can say, okay, well, when is the narrator? Because the narrator's position in time may give away more than anything else. In this case, the narrator is 20 years after the war, so post-war 20, which is why when I indicated way back here, I said PW, right? Not here. Yeah, here we go. Here. So here you'll see that I talked about PW post-war, right? Okay. Back from Swindon, and here we go again. All right. So we can say, and then having done that, we can say, what kind of narrator is the narrator? Now, there are a number of different narrators that you will be used to. We are perhaps most familiar with, I don't know about that. I don't want to make a generalization about what you're most familiar with because it depends on what you like to read. One of the narrators that we're familiar with is the narrator as God position. This is a very old narrative position. It's something that we Westerners, that is people in France, Germany, and Italy, Spain, Great Britain, and then America, became comfortable with in the 19th century, in the 18th and 19th century, where, especially in the 19th century, where the idea that the narrator is God, their author makes everything happen. And so in this case, Hellboy, I've given Hellboy the job here. I suspect he's over there. For me, he's here, but I think for you guys, he's there. He, in this case, I've given him the job of narrator. He controls everything. So everything points to him. Everything comes from him and everything points to him. So the narrator is the one who tells Kurt Lemon's death. The narrator is the one who tells about the Lemon Tree Song, about the narrator on Sunlight, and so on. The narrator is the one that controls all these different pieces of the narrative because, after all, the narrator is the author's final word inside the text. So that's one of the sort of conclusions that we can make. In this case, the narrator appears to be the same guy, and I pointed to this, gestured to this before. The narrator appears to be the same guy as the guy in the stories, but as I mentioned, that's a mistake, right? Because there's the narrator who is a guy named Tim O'Brien. We just get confused by that. But that isn't the Tim O'Brien, the guy who wrote this book. That's a different guy, right? So if I write a novel with a character named Tim Blackmore in it, Tim Blackmore is my creation. There's me, Tim Blackmore, and then there's my creation, Tim Blackmore. And even if I make Tim Blackmore write about another Tim Blackmore inside the book, they're still all creations of mine, right? So is the narrator part of the story or out of it? You know, how far is the narrator into the story? Are they fully invested? You know, are they victims? Are they the victimizer? You know, are they, what kind of character are they? Are they, if they're inside or outside, how invested are they? You know, do they like the characters? Do they hate them? Because every now and then you'll get a narrator that'll say, you know, as much as I, you know, see that so-and-so had a tough time, I can't bring myself to feel sorry for them. You're like, oh, you can't? Why not? It's like, well, because presumably you were involved in that. So the narrator was involved in these things, right? Is the narrator prepared to lie as long as you get the picture? So how trustworthy is the narrator? Is the narrator then reliable? And consider that Mitchell Saunders says on page 70, this next part, Saunders said quietly, you won't believe. Probably not, I said. You won't. And you know why? He gave me a long, tired smile. Because it happened. Because every word is absolutely dead on true. And Saunders made a sound in his throat like a sigh, as if to say he didn't care if I believed him or not. But he did care. He wanted me to feel the truth. Right? So what do you do when a friend has heard a story from you so often, or maybe you're sort of used to kind of telling stories and sort of making stuff up and pulling people's legs, and then there comes a time when the stakes are really high and you really want them to believe you, like, I'm not kidding around, like, this is really happening. They're like, yeah, sure, it happened. Tim is like, no, this is really serious. You have to believe me. They're like, yeah, okay, sure. And they're so this can be very aggravating. It's like, well, what gets sacrificed? If I want you to feel that the thing is really true, then what am I prepared to do? Am I prepared to inflate some numbers, make it sound worse than it was? What is it going to take me to make you feel what I feel? That's the question, right? So Saunders on page 73 says, I got a confession to make. Last night, man, I had to make up a few things. So sure, sure enough, we're like, oh, baby, this is not a good sign. Like, what did you make up? And if you made stuff up, how can I trust you now? What do I know? And what do I know becomes the operative question when we interpret texts. What do we know for sure? Because maybe the whole thing becomes destabilized. So what are we going to do? Now, I know that at this point you may say, I can't tolerate any of this stuff, Tim. Forget it. I'll just, thanks very much for this. Thanks for making my life even more complex than it was. I don't want any more than that. It's like, just hang in there. Okay. I'm telling you, let's keep it simple, right? These are just a few tools that are going to be useful to us as we look through stories in the next 20 or so lectures. So just hang in there and trust the force, Luke. Okay, and now I'm going to put in a little clip so you can get a break from me talking from the fall. Okay.
Alexandria the Great.
All right, what? I'll tell you. Just come in here. No, come on, grab that chair right there. All right. Don't break your other arm.
Thank you.
You're welcome. What's in your box?
Things I like.
Things you stole?
No. A photo.
Where'd you get the elephant?
My friend gave it to me at work. He's from India. Look. This is my horse. And this is my father.
Yeah.
He's got the same gap in his teeth. Must run in the family.
Yeah, and here is my house.
Oh, yeah?
It was my house.
What happened?
They burned it.
Who burned it?
Angry people.
I'm sorry to hear that. I said I'm sorry to hear that.
Angry people.
Yeah, I know. I'm just sorry. I'm sorry that your house got burned.
Why did Alexander didn't go from that buildings on his horse? If he was lost,
What?
why did Alexander didn't go from that middle of the buildings, on his horse?
Well, first of all,
He didn't have a horse, because his horse was killed in a battle. And he wasn't in the middle of any old buildings. He was lost in the middle of a vast desert full of orange sand, with only a handful of men. But they didn't have any water. My lord, all hope is lost. It seems your mighty army shall finally be conquered. Not by the Persians, but by our own greed and gluttony for water. This helmet contains our last supply. O king, I believe your wisdom shall save us all.
Why?
What?
Why?
Well, because there wasn't enough water for all of them, and it was Alexander the Great's way of showing his army that they were all equal. That
It's stupid.
what would you do better?
Because Alexander flowed the water instead to give every soldier a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay, so as an amazing film. This is The Fall by Tarsem Singh. Just goes by Tarsem in this film, with Lee Pace playing the Roy and Katinka, the little girl, whose narrative he will include in his story. And so this is a story about stories in part. And it's also about their narrative. But it's a story that he will tell her. And so it includes things from the box that she has. And it will include she's made one of these cutout snowflakes. And so he includes that. And so that's the message that from the messenger it's her own message that she's carrying. So there's wonderful sort of points about the fluidity between the person and the narrator, that when we begin to read something or hear something, we begin to populate it with our ideas, and our ideas are not going to come from the author because the author doesn't know who we are. So the author says, and then it was a sunny day. You're like, well, you fill in what kind of sunny day it was. It was a vast desert. Like, well, what does it look like? You fill that in, right, with various different kinds of pictures. So there's an enormously organic relationship between the narrator and us. And so what kind of person is the narrator, and who are we, right? It's going to make a difference as to how we interpret, which is why your point of view and your understanding of these texts is going to be much more important than really anything else. It's more important than my understanding of it, more important than anybody else's understanding of it. Your friends, doesn't matter. What matters is what you understand. Okay. So the stakes can be really high, right? This is what I was talking about at the very beginning. And for Norman Bowker, it looks as though one thing, the causation leads to this. So it's not terrible, he wrote me, but you left out Vietnam. Where's Kiowa? Where's the shit? 8 months later, he hanged himself, right, on page 153 to 154. So did he kill himself because the story was told badly? Because that's what it sounds like. The way that O'Brien tells this is a little narrative in itself, right? This it's not terrible, but you left out Vietnam. Where's Kyo? Where's the shit? 8 months later, he hanged himself. So our suggestion, the suggestion that O'Brien is making to us as readers, is that because of this. Well, because of the way that's organized. If you'd put in a few more lines, then I went away and did some other things. I heard later that O'Brien Bowker had trouble. He'd had he'd had a drinking problem. And 8 months later, he killed himself. It's like there wouldn't be such a. It's like, well, did this lead to that, or what if there was other stuff in between? Is, in other words, the failure O'Brien's, the narrator's, basically because he told the story incorrectly? And so on page 68. O'Brien says, in many cases, a true war story cannot be believed. If you believe it, be skeptical. It's a question of credibility. Often the crazy stuff is true, and the normal stuff isn't, because the normal stuff is necessary to make you believe the truly incredible craziness. In other cases, you can't even tell a true war story. Sometimes it's just beyond telling. Okay, so again, here's a paragraph which appears to be really, it's like, what? We can't understand that. It's like, no, you can. So let's go back through it a little bit slowly. In many cases, a true war story cannot be believed. It's like, okay, fair enough. If you believe it, be skeptical. All right, let's say somebody tells you a story and you're like, yeah, I believe that. You're like, wait a second, I believed it? Why did I believe it? Was it because it just, I want them to believe it? Because I liked the idea of that story. This is the kind of story I like. I'm a sucker for, I'm a sucker for a love story. Oh, and then would they live happily ever after? They did. Oh, isn't that wonderful? It's like, wait a second, I believed it. Why? Okay. So if you believe it, be skeptical, right? That is, if you have belief, be doubting. It's a question of credibility. Sure is, right? Everything really is a matter of trust here in this narrative world. Often the crazy stuff is true and the normal stuff isn't. Okay, so what may seem normal to us in a war story, like, I don't know, then they went out and killed a bunch of men. It's like, and you're like, oh yeah, sure. They're always saying that in war stories. But they get out onto the battlefield. Let's say they get out on the battlefield and there was nobody to kill. You're like, what? That doesn't happen in war stories. It's like, well, maybe that's what really happened. But how are you going to make people believe that? Well, you have to put some quote unquote reality, things that people expect, into a narrative to keep them there. Okay. In other cases, you can't even tell a true war story. Like there is no telling. It's just impossible to tell it unless maybe you can tell it to somebody who has experienced some of the same events. Often veterans can only tell a story to other veterans, partly because they don't want to put up with people saying, oh, that didn't really happen. It's like, shut up. Sometimes, as he says, it's just beyond telling on page 68. Okay, and now we will move on to the last section of this lecture.